My name is Victoria Blake, and at 28, I thought I understood family loyalty. When my beloved grandmother Margaret passed away last month after battling cancer, I discovered through my cousin's accidentally forwarded email that I wasn't invited to the will reading. Despite the knot in my stomach telling me to stay away, I showed up anyway. We already handled everything, my Aunt Patricia announced with barely concealed satisfaction. You weren't included for obvious reasons. Then Mr. Thompson, the family lawyer, frowned deeply and said, "But Miss Blake is the only beneficiary named in the will." The room went silent as death itself. If you've ever been the family scapegoat who turned out to hold all the cards, you'll want to hear how the story ends, because what happened next changed everything. Growing up as the daughter of Margaret Blake's youngest son David wasn't easy, but my father made sure I had a childhood filled with love. He was the family rebel who chose to become a social worker instead of joining the family's real estate empire that had dominated Charleston for 3 generations. My mother, Catherine, worked as a pediatric nurse, and together they raised me with values centered on helping others rather than accumulating wealth. Every Sunday, we'd visit grandmother Margaret's sprawling antebellum mansion in the historic district, a magnificent home that had housed Blake family members since before the Civil War. When I was 11, everything changed overnight. My father died in a car accident during a thunderstorm while rushing to help a family in crisis. My mother struggled emotionally and financially, working double shifts at the children's hospital just to keep our small apartment. Grandmother Margaret stepped in without hesitation. "Victoria will spend weekdays with me," she announced to the family, brooking no argument. For the next 7 years, I split my time between my mother's modest apartment and grandmother's mansion. While my mother worked herself to exhaustion, grandmother became my second parent, my mentor, my anchor. "You're different from the others, Victoria," she would tell me as we sat in her garden among the ancient oak trees. "You see people's hearts, not their bank accounts." Her words shaped me more than she ever knew. Grandmother Margaret wasn't your typical Charleston socialite. She wore simple clothes, volunteered at homeless shelters, and quietly funded scholarships for underprivileged children. The mansion was her one indulgence, filled with family memories spanning generations rather than showcased wealth. My Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia never understood her choices. They lived in modern McMansions in gated communities, drove luxury cars, and constantly pressured grandmother to live up to her social status. When I decided to follow my mother's path and become a nurse, specifically choosing trauma care, my extended family was horrified. Uncle Richard cornered me at Thanksgiving dinner when I was 22. "You could work for Blake Properties, Victoria. Why waste your potential on a career with such limited earning power?" He swirled his bourbon while looking down at me with obvious disappointment. "Your grandmother could make one phone call and set you up for life." "I want to earn my own way, Uncle Richard," I replied simply. The concept seemed to physically pain him. My cousins Jessica and Kevin, both MBA graduates working for their father's company, found my choice incomprehensible. They'd grown up expecting inheritance and connections to pave their golden path. Jessica once asked me with genuine confusion, "But don't you want to be wealthy?" The idea that I might value something beyond money was completely foreign to them. As grandmother aged into her 80s, her health began declining. I started visiting 3 times weekly, bringing groceries, organizing medications, and often just sitting with her. We'd cook together using recipes passed down through generations. Her famous praline cookies were legendary in Charleston society, but I was the only one who knew the secret ingredient was a pinch of sea salt from Folly Beach. "You've got flour in your hair again," she'd laugh, reaching up with a kitchen towel. Even as her body weakened, her mind remained sharp as a tack, her wit quick and cutting. During these visits, she shared family stories that no one else seemed interested in hearing. How her own grandmother had been one of the first women to own property in Charleston after Reconstruction. How the family fortune originally came from her great-grandfather's shipping business. Stories of struggle, perseverance, and occasional failure that humanized our family beyond the polished facade presented at charity galas. "Remember, Victoria," she told me during one afternoon as we sorted through old photographs, "money doesn't make someone worthy. How they treat others when there's nothing to gain, That's the true measure of character. Meanwhile, as grandmother's health issues became more pronounced, the rest of the family visited only when convenient. Uncle Richard would stop by monthly, spending more time photographing antiques than connecting with his mother. Aunt Patricia brought expensive gifts grandmother couldn't use, then left after exactly 1 hour, always checking her watch. My cousins rarely visited unless major holidays required their presence. They'd arrive, take photos for social media, then disappear. Last December, grandmother gave me a small velvet box. "This belonged to my mother," she said, placing it in my hands. Inside was a simple pearl necklace, nothing flashy or particularly valuable by Charleston standards. "It's beautiful," I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "I want you to have it now," she insisted, fastening it around my neck. "The others would just see jewelry, but you understand that value comes from who wore it." I had no idea this small gift would later be used as evidence against me. Our final conversation haunts me still. Grandmother was having a good day, sitting upright in her favorite chair overlooking the garden. As I prepared to leave for my night shift at the hospital, she took my hand with surprising strength. "Victoria, I've been watching everyone carefully for years," she said, her blue eyes clear and intense. "I want you to know that I see everything, and soon I'll be setting things right." I assumed she meant finding peace before passing. I never imagined she was orchestrating something that would expose our family's true nature. The first major crack in our family foundation happened 2 years ago when grandmother was 86. Uncle Richard called an emergency family meeting at the mansion, supposedly to discuss grandmother's care. When I arrived from my shift at the hospital, I found not just family members, but also a real estate developer waiting in the formal living room. "We've been discussing the beach house," Uncle Richard announced, referring to our family's historic property on Sullivan's Island where grandmother had spent every summer since childhood. "It sits empty most of the year, and the maintenance costs are astronomical," he continued. "Plus, mother can't enjoy it anymore at her age." I glanced at grandmother, whose expression appeared neutral, but I knew her well enough to see the tension around her mouth. "Has grandmother agreed to this?" I asked directly. Uncle Richard waved dismissively. "Mother understands it's the practical decision. At her age, she can't travel to the beach house anymore anyway." "Actually," I said carefully, "we were just discussing last week how much she's looking forward to spending time there this summer." The room fell silent. Aunt Patricia cleared her throat awkwardly. "Victoria, dear, perhaps you misunderstood. Mother knows her limitations." Grandmother finally spoke up, her voice steady and firm. "I told Victoria exactly that. I have no intention of selling my beach house." The developer awkwardly excused himself, and once he left, Uncle Richard turned his anger on me. "You always interfere," he snapped. "You think you know what's best because you spend time here, but you don't understand the financial realities." "What I understand," I replied evenly, "is that grandmother should make her own decisions about her property." That evening, after everyone else had left, Uncle Richard cornered me in the kitchen. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You may think you're special to her, but you're overstepping. Don't forget who built this family's wealth, and it certainly wasn't your father." The comment about my father hit like a physical blow, but I stood my ground. "This isn't about money, Uncle Richard. It's about respecting grandmother's wishes." From that day forward, Uncle Richard began what I can only describe as a systematic campaign to turn the family against me. It started subtly with comments to other relatives about how I was manipulating grandmother, suggestions that I was positioning myself for special treatment in the will. By Christmas, it was obvious that many in the extended family had turned against me. At the holiday dinner, Aunt Patricia accidentally excluded me from the family photograph. Cousin Jessica made pointed comments about gold diggers while staring directly at me. Even distant relatives who had always been kind grew noticeably cold. After dinner, I overheard Uncle Richard talking to Cousin Kevin by the fireplace. "We need to protect Mother from Victoria's influence. She's got her wrapped around her finger, and who knows what she's convincing her to do." I tried addressing these suspicions directly, sending emails to my aunts and uncles explaining that I had no interest in grandmother's money, that I simply wanted her final years to be comfortable and on her terms. The responses were lukewarm at best. Aunt Patricia replied curtly, "We all want what's best for Mother," while others didn't respond at all. The following Easter, I discovered through social media that the family had held a gathering at Uncle Richard's house. I wasn't invited. In the photos, Grandmother sat in the corner looking confused and isolated. I called her that evening. "Did you enjoy the Easter celebration?" I asked carefully. "It was fine," she said, then lowered her voice. "But the ham was overcooked, and Richard's house is always freezing." I kept my coat on the entire time. "I wish I could have been there," I said honestly. There was a pause. "You weren't invited?" The genuine surprise in her voice confirmed my suspicions. She hadn't been told I was excluded. As Grandmother's health declined more rapidly, the family began actively limiting my access to her. Aunt Patricia instituted a rigid visiting schedule that allocated me only 2 hours on Sunday afternoons, claiming it was to prevent overwhelming Mother. When I arrived for these limited visits, I often found a cousin or aunt suddenly deciding to drop by at the same time, making private conversations impossible. I found ways to maintain our connection despite their interference. I would bring lunch during my days off from the hospital. Rosa, the compassionate home health aide who genuinely cared for Grandmother, would sometimes call me directly when she thought Grandmother needed company or was having a particularly good day. These women became my allies in ensuring Grandmother wasn't isolated from the one family member who truly cherished her company. Last Christmas, I wasn't invited to the family gathering at all. I received a text from Aunt Patricia, keeping the holidays small this year. Mother needs rest. Later, I learned from Rosa that small meant everyone except me. On Christmas Eve, I dropped off a package with Rosa, Grandmother's favorite praline cookies that we used to bake together, a soft cashmere shawl in her favorite blue, and a photo album I'd created featuring pictures from the beach house across the decades. When Grandmother passed away in April, I didn't receive the news from family. Rosa called me in tears from the mansion. By the time I arrived, Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia were already there with a funeral director, making arrangements without any input from me. "Oh, Victoria," Aunt Patricia said with artificial sweetness when she saw me. "We were going to call you, naturally." The funeral became a display of family politics. I was seated in the third row behind extended family members who had barely known Grandmother. I wasn't asked to speak despite having spent more time with her than anyone in recent years. Uncle Richard delivered a eulogy focusing primarily on Grandmother's late husband's business achievements and the family legacy. Throughout the service, I kept thinking about Grandmother's words about setting things right. I had no idea how prophetic they would prove to be. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was preparing dinner in my small apartment when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Cousin Jessica, clearly sent to a group chat by mistake. "Tomorrow at Thompson's office, 2 p.m. Mom says don't tell Victoria." A second later, another message appeared. "Sorry, wrong chat. Ignore that, please." I stared at the message, my stomach dropping. They weren't planning to tell me about the will reading. Whatever inheritance Grandmother might have left me, they intended to keep me completely in the dark. I spent the entire night debating my options. Part of me wanted to respect their wishes, to rise above the pettiness. But a stronger part knew that Grandmother would want me there, regardless of what they thought. By morning, I had made my decision. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did. I carefully selected my outfit, a simple black dress that Grandmother had always complimented, professional but not ostentatious. I wanted to look respectful, not desperate. As I drove to the law office in downtown Charleston, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I rehearsed what I might say, how I would handle the inevitable confrontation. In the parking garage, I sat for several minutes gathering courage. "Stand up for yourself, Victoria," I could almost hear Grandmother say. "You belong anywhere I wanted you to be." The law office of Thompson and Associates occupied an entire floor of a distinguished building overlooking the harbor. When the elevator doors opened, I saw them immediately: Uncle Richard and Aunt Patricia, cousins Jessica and Kevin, plus several distant relatives I barely recognized, all clustered in the elegant waiting area. Aunt Patricia saw me first. Her face froze mid-sentence, then quickly rearranged into a mask of disapproval. "Victoria," she said loudly, causing everyone to turn. What are you doing here? I lifted my chin slightly. I'm here for grandmother's will reading. Uncle Richard stepped forward, physically positioning himself between me and the group. You weren't invited. This is for family only. I am family, I said simply. You know what he means, Jessica interjected coldly. Family who respected grandmother's wishes instead of trying to influence her. Before I could respond, a distinguished man with silver hair appeared. Are we all here for the Margaret Blake estate? He asked, then noticed the obvious tension. Is there some problem? Aunt Patricia stepped forward with her most charming smile. Mr. Thompson, there seems to be a misunderstanding. Victoria wasn't supposed to be included in today's reading. Mr. Thompson looked genuinely confused. Miss Victoria Blake, Margaret's granddaughter? Yes, that's me, I confirmed. He consulted his notes. Then you're absolutely supposed to be here. Please, everyone, come into the conference room. The conference room was elegant with mahogany paneling and leather chairs. I took a seat near the door, feeling every eye on me. The whispers were barely concealed. She must have found out somehow. Richard is going to be furious. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, bringing the room to order. Before we begin, I should mention that I was Margaret's friend as well as her attorney for over 30 years. She was extraordinarily specific about her wishes. He reached for a thick folder, but Aunt Patricia interrupted. Mr. Thompson, I feel I should explain the situation with Victoria. She wasn't invited today because we've already discussed most of the estate distribution. We didn't want to waste your time with unnecessary complications. I felt my face burning as everyone stared at me again. We already handled everything, she announced with finality. You weren't included for obvious reasons. Mr. Thompson frowned, looking genuinely puzzled. I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding, Mrs. Blake. Nothing should have been distributed yet without proper legal proceedings. He looked directly at me. And as for Miss Victoria Blake not being invited, that would be highly irregular considering the contents of the will. What do you mean? Uncle Richard demanded, his voice sharp with anxiety. Mr. Thompson opened the folder and adjusted his reading glasses. I mean that Miss Victoria Blake is the only beneficiary named in the will. The room went completely silent. I felt as though all oxygen had been sucked from the space, leaving us in a vacuum where no one dared breathe. That's impossible, Uncle Richard finally sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of red. There must be some mistake. I assure you, there is no mistake, Mr. Thompson replied firmly. Perhaps it would be best if I simply read the will as Margaret intended. He put on his reading glasses and began in a clear, authoritative voice. I, Margaret Catherine Blake, being of sound mind and body, hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. The formal legal language continued briefly before he reached the critical section. After careful consideration and years of observation, I have made my decision regarding the distribution of my estate. I hereby bequeath all my property, both real and personal, including but not limited to my primary residence on Meeting Street, my beach house on Sullivan's Island, all financial accounts, investments, personal belongings, and family heirlooms to my granddaughter, Victoria Catherine Blake. There was a collective gasp that seemed to echo off the mahogany walls. Jessica dropped her designer handbag, and her water bottle rolled across the hardwood floor. No one moved to retrieve it. This can't be legal, Uncle Richard said, his voice shaking with rage. Mr. Thompson continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. I have prepared a personal letter explaining my decisions, which I will provide to Victoria privately. However, I wish to make clear that this decision was made with full mental capacity and careful consideration. He looked up from the document. There is additional information, but perhaps we should address immediate concerns first. Aunt Patricia was crying now, her expensive makeup streaking down her cheeks. After everything we did for her, she sobbed. The medical appointments, the family obligations, maintaining her social standing in Charleston society. Kevin leaned forward aggressively. We'll contest this. She was clearly not thinking straight. Mr. Thompson shook his head slightly. I would strongly advise against that course of action. Margaret anticipated this reaction and took extensive measures to document her mental competence. She underwent comprehensive cognitive evaluations by 3 separate neurologists in the months before her passing, all of whom certified her as fully competent to make these decisions. As the reality began sinking in, I remembered grandmother's words. I've been watching everyone for years. She hadn't been making idle conversation. She had been conducting an elaborate test, observing how we all behaved when we thought there was nothing to gain. Mr. Thompson reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Victoria, your grandmother asked me to give you this letter privately, but given the circumstances, you might want to share certain portions. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and began reading silently. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then I've passed on to whatever comes next, and you've just learned that you're my sole heir. I imagine the family isn't taking it well. For years, I've watched how each of you behaved around me. Richard visited only when he wanted to discuss liquidating my assets. Patricia came with expensive gifts, but never stayed for real conversation. The grandchildren called only on birthdays and holidays, if then. But you, Victoria, came because you wanted to be with me. You listened to my stories, learned my recipes, and treated me like a person worth knowing, not a bank account waiting to be accessed. I've been conducting a careful evaluation these past years. I deliberately mentioned valuable items around different family members to see their reactions. I watched who asked about my health and who asked about my investments. I noticed who helped from love and who helped from obligation. You were the only one who never failed the test. The others will claim I was manipulated or confused, but the truth is simpler. I wanted my legacy in the hands of someone who would honor its spirit, not just preserve its value. With complete love and confidence in you, Grandmother Margaret. I looked up from the letter, tears streaming down my face, to find the room in complete chaos. Uncle Richard was on his phone, presumably calling his lawyer. Aunt Patricia was demanding that Mr. Thompson explain how this could be legal. Jessica was sobbing while Kevin stared at the wall in shocked silence. There's something else you should all know, Mr. Thompson said loudly, cutting through the noise. Margaret documented everything meticulously. She kept detailed records of visits, conversations, and behaviors. She installed a comprehensive security system 2 years ago that tracked who came and went from both properties. She saved text messages and emails. She even made audio recordings, which is completely legal in South Carolina with single-party consent. He opened another folder. Furthermore, Margaret was aware that items had already been removed from her home without permission. She maintained a complete inventory with photographs of all her possessions. That's ridiculous, Aunt Patricia scoffed, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. Then perhaps you can explain why the Waterford crystal collection from the dining room is currently displayed in your home, or why Margaret's diamond bracelet was photographed on Jessica's wrist at a charity auction last month. The color drained from their faces as he continued. The will includes a specific provision requiring the return of all items removed from Margaret's properties within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action for theft. Uncle Richard finally exploded. This is your doing, he shouted at me, pointing a trembling finger. You manipulated a sick old woman. You turned her against her own family. I thought of all those Sunday afternoons talking about books and gardening and family history. I thought of driving grandmother to doctor appointments when no one else would take time off work. I thought of the simple joy on her face when I brought her favorite tea just because it was Tuesday. No, Uncle Richard, I said quietly. Grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She always did. The aftermath was brutal. I left Mr. Thompson's office that day clutching grandmother's letter and my family's threats ringing in my ears. Uncle Richard's parting words were, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." He wasn't exaggerating. The very next morning, my phone started ringing before dawn. First Aunt Patricia, then Jessica, then relatives I barely knew, all demanding explanations, making accusations, or attempting to negotiate for items they felt entitled to. I stopped answering unknown numbers, but the voicemails accumulated. Victoria, this is Aunt Patricia. I expect you to do the right thing here. Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly toward the end. We all saw the signs. Call me immediately. It's Jessica. Look, I know we haven't been close, but that pearl necklace was promised to me years ago. I have witnesses who heard grandmother mention it. Victoria, this is Uncle Richard. My attorney will be contacting you soon. What you've done is despicable and won't hold up in court. By week's end, the harassment had moved to social media. Jessica posted a thinly veiled attack, amazing how some people can pretend to care about family just to manipulate inheritance. True colors always show eventually. Distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly messaged me, either condemning me or trying to establish friendly connections now that I controlled significant wealth. I changed my phone number and made all my social media accounts private, but the stress was devastating. I wasn't sleeping, had constant headaches, and my supervisor at the hospital noticed I was making errors completely unlike me. Victoria, is everything all right? She asked after I forgot to update a patient chart. This isn't like you at all. I broke down and told her everything. She immediately insisted I take medical leave. Your patients need you at your best, she said gently. Take time to handle your legal situation. During that week off, I finally visited grandmother's house, my house now, according to the will. I used the key I'd had for years and walked into rooms that still smelled faintly of her lavender perfume. But something was terribly wrong. The house felt hollow, with obvious empty spaces on walls and shelves. Moving from room to room, I began realizing the extent of what had happened while I was excluded. The antique grandfather clock that had always stood in the hallway was gone. Grandmother's collection of first edition books had several missing volumes. Her jewelry box in the bedroom was nearly empty. They had systematically looted the house, taking not just valuable items, but things of purely sentimental value. The quilt her mother had sewn, the collection of seashells from decades of beach vacations, even her worn cookbook with handwritten notes in the margins. I collapsed onto her bed, now stripped of the handmade coverlet that should have been there, and sobbed until I was empty. It wasn't about monetary value, it was the deliberate erasure of her presence, the theft of memories I had hoped to preserve. Hidden in her closet, I found a small safe I hadn't known existed. After trying several combinations, I used her birth date and it opened. Inside was a leather journal, several flash drives, and a note in her handwriting, for Victoria, use when necessary. The journal was extraordinary. Every visit documented, every conversation recorded, every borrowed item that was never returned cataloged. She had been building an irrefutable case for years. One entry from 6 months before her death was particularly revealing. Richard visited today, spent 5 minutes asking about my health, then an hour trying to convince me to sell the beach house for tax reasons. When I refused, he became quite angry and said I was being stubborn about a deteriorating asset. What he doesn't realize is that I had the property appraised last month. It's worth nearly triple what we paid for it. Another entry was even more damning. Patricia brought Jessica for a casual visit today. While Patricia kept me occupied downstairs, Jessica spent nearly 30 minutes alone in my bedroom. After they left, I checked my jewelry box. As I suspected, my diamond bracelet is missing. I've photographed the empty space and updated my inventory. They don't know about the security cameras I had installed last year. Armed with this evidence, I contacted Mr. Thompson immediately. I need to fight back, I told him. They've stolen so much already. Margaret suspected this might happen, he said gravely. She was incredibly thorough in her preparations. Let me connect you with a litigation specialist. The attorney, Linda Martinez, was a formidable woman in her 50s known for her relentless approach to estate disputes. She reviewed grandmother's documentation and immediately began drafting demands for the return of stolen property. This is one of the most well-documented cases I've ever encountered, she told me. Your grandmother was extraordinarily methodical in building her case. The legal pushback only intensified my family's campaign against me. Uncle Richard, true to his word, filed a lawsuit contesting the will on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. Aunt Patricia began calling my colleagues at the hospital, suggesting I had neglected patients to spend time manipulating my grandmother. My supervisor called me into her office. Victoria, I know these accusations are baseless, but they're becoming disruptive. Several families have expressed concerns after receiving calls from your relatives. My professional reputation, built through years of dedicated patient care, was being systematically attacked. The stress became so severe I developed chronic insomnia and started having panic attacks. My doctor prescribed anxiety medication and strongly recommended therapy. Your physical symptoms are directly related to this ongoing trauma, she explained. This level of family conflict creates genuine psychological damage. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a local reporter contacted me asking for comment on the Blake family estate dispute that has divided one of Charleston's most prominent families. The story had somehow leaked to the press. That night, alone in my apartment with blackout curtains drawn, I hit rock bottom. I seriously considered surrendering, signing over the inheritance just to end the nightmare. I pulled out grandmother's letter again, seeking comfort in her words, when my phone pinged with a text from an unknown number. Victoria, it's Rosa. I kept some things your grandmother wanted you to have. Special things I hid away. Can we meet? The next day, Rosa handed me a small box. She made me promise to keep these separate from everything else in the house. She said you'd know what to do when the time came. Inside were memory cards and a small digital recorder. When I plugged the first card into my laptop, I found dozens of video files. Grandmother sitting in her favorite chair, talking directly to the camera. In the first video, dated nearly a year before her death, she looked directly into the lens with clear, sharp eyes. My name is Margaret Catherine Blake. Today is September 22nd, and I am recording this of my own free will with complete mental capacity, as Mr. Thompson can verify. The camera panned to show Mr. Thompson sitting nearby, who stated his name and the date for the record. I want to explain my decisions regarding my will, grandmother continued. For years, I have observed my family's behavior toward me. I have tested their character and motivations, and I have made my decisions based on clear evidence. She went on to detail specific incidents, dates, and observations that led to her decision to leave everything to me. Her voice was strong, her reasoning crystal clear and methodical. As I watched video after video, I felt grandmother's presence surrounding me like a protective embrace. She hadn't just left me her possessions, she had armed me with the means to defend her wishes against any challenge. She had anticipated exactly what would happen and prepared for every possible attack. In the final video, recorded just weeks before her death, she looked frilier, but her eyes remained bright with determination. Victoria, if you're watching this, then things have become difficult, as I knew they would. Remember what I always taught you about standing up for yourself. Sometimes kindness means having the courage to enforce boundaries. I didn't raise you to be anyone's doormat, my dear. I raised you to be strong like me, and I never let anyone take advantage of me without consequences. For the first time since the will reading, I felt my old strength returning. Grandmother had entrusted me not just with her wealth, but with her legacy and reputation. I couldn't let her down. The next morning, I called Linda Martinez. I have something that changes everything, I told her, and brought over all the videos and recordings. After reviewing them, she leaned back in her chair with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. This doesn't just change everything, it ends everything. Your grandmother didn't just build a legal case, she created an impenetrable fortress. With this new evidence, we developed a comprehensive counter-strategy. First, we filed a formal inventory of all missing items with the probate court, complete with photographs and documentation of their current locations. Then we sent legal demands for the return of every stolen item with clear deadlines and consequences. Simultaneously, Linda filed a motion to dismiss Uncle Richard's lawsuit, attaching grandmother's videos as irrefutable evidence. No judge in South Carolina will rule against your grandmother after seeing these recordings, she assured me confidently. We also reached out to the hospital's legal team, providing evidence that the accusations against me were part of a coordinated harassment campaign designed to damage my reputation. They immediately issued cease and desist letters to my relatives, threatening legal action if the defamatory calls continued. For additional support, I contacted several nurses and aides who had cared for grandmother in her final months. They were eager to provide sworn statements about the frequency of my visits compared to other family members. You were there at least 3 times a week, confirmed Nurse Williams. Sometimes your uncle would go 6 weeks without showing up, then spend his entire visit making phone calls. Rosa provided a detailed visitor log she had maintained, showing I had visited grandmother 87 times in her final year, while Uncle Richard visited 9 times and Aunt Patricia visited 12 times. My cousins had each visited only on major holidays. We also obtained financial records revealing that Uncle Richard had borrowed substantial amounts from grandmother over the years without repayment, and that Aunt Patricia had charged numerous personal expenses to grandmother's accounts under the pretense of caregiving costs. Armed with this overwhelming evidence, Linda suggested calling a family meeting at her office. Sometimes revealing your complete hand at once can end months of pointless litigation, she explained. The day of the meeting, I arrived early, my stomach churning despite our strong position. One by one, they filed in, Uncle Richard with his nervous attorney who kept checking his watch, Aunt Patricia refusing to make eye contact, cousins Jessica and Kevin trying to appear confident while clearly anxious about what was coming. Thank you all for coming, Linda began once everyone was seated. We've requested this meeting to resolve outstanding issues regarding Margaret Blake's estate. Uncle Richard's attorney immediately launched into a prepared statement about significant concerns regarding undue influence and questionable testamentary capacity. Linda let him finish completely before responding. Before we proceed further, there are materials everyone should review. She pressed a remote control, and the large screen came to life with grandmother's face. My name is Margaret Catherine Blake, her clear, strong voice filled the conference room. Today is September 22nd, and I am recording this of my own free will with complete mental capacity. As the video played, I watched my family's faces transform. Uncle Richard grew increasingly pale. Aunt Patricia's hand flew to cover her mouth. Jessica began crying silently while Kevin stared at the screen in obvious shock. When it ended, Linda said simply, "There are 23 more videos like this one, each addressing specific incidents and decisions." Margaret Blake was perhaps the most thorough client I've ever represented. She changed the screen to display a detailed spreadsheet. This is the current inventory of items removed from Margaret's properties without authorization. Next to each item is photographic evidence, documentation of its removal, and its appraised value. The total currently exceeds $600,000. The room was absolutely silent except for the sound of Jessica's quiet sobbing. Miss Blake is prepared to file criminal charges for theft if these items are not returned within 7 days, Linda continued in a matter-of-fact tone. Additionally, we have extensive documentation of financial exploitation that would be of significant interest to the district attorney's office. Uncle Richard's attorney leaned over and whispered urgently in his ear for several minutes. Finally, Uncle Richard cleared his throat. Perhaps we've all acted hastily. Emotions run high after losing someone we all loved, especially when significant assets are involved. I couldn't resist adding quietly, grandmother always said the most revealing moments come when people think there's something to gain or lose. The meeting ended with Uncle Richard's attorney requesting time to review the evidence and advise his client properly. 2 days later, he called Linda to inform her they would be withdrawing their lawsuit challenging the will. Within a week, items began appearing on grandmother's porch, delivered by professional moving companies rather than returned personally. The jewelry came back via courier, each piece carefully packaged with no notes or apologies, but at least they were complying with our demands. I hadn't expected direct contact from any of them, so I was surprised when Aunt Patricia called me personally. "Victoria," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharpness and authority. "We didn't understand how much those final years meant to Mother. We missed so much." "You never asked," I replied simply, honestly. There was a long pause on the line. "We thought you were taking advantage of her kindness. We didn't understand why she preferred spending time with you over her other family members." "Because I saw her as a person worth knowing, not a trust fund with legs," I said, borrowing one of grandmother's own phrases. Another pause. "Some of us would like to talk, to explain our actions, maybe even to apologize properly." I considered her words carefully. "I'm willing to listen, but I need time to heal first." After we hung up, I sat in grandmother's living room, truly my living room now, surrounded by the returned items that carried her memory in every detail. The legal victories felt hollow in some ways. I had the house, the possessions, the complete vindication, but I'd lost what remained of my family relationships in the process. The next day, I took action that surprised even myself. I called each family member individually, offering them the opportunity to select one meaningful item from grandmother's belongings. Not the most valuable pieces, but something with genuine sentimental significance to remember her by. Some declined, still too proud or angry to accept anything from me. But Jessica surprised me by asking for grandmother's recipe collection. She taught me to make praline cookies once when I was little, she admitted quietly. It's one of my few really good memories with her before everything became so complicated. Kevin requested grandfather's old fishing rod from the beach house. He took me fishing a couple times when I was really young, before Dad started focusing only on business success. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed those mornings until now. Uncle Richard predictably declined my offer with stiff formality, but Aunt Patricia asked for one of grandmother's watercolor paintings, a simple seascape of the Sullivan's Island beach at sunset. She painted this summer before she married your grandfather, she told me, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. I always admired it hanging in her bedroom. She had real artistic talent that got overshadowed by social expectations. These small gestures didn't heal the deep wounds that had been inflicted during the legal battle, but they were a beginning, a recognition that grandmother had been more than her wealth. She had been a person who had touched all our lives in different ways, even if we'd lost sight of that truth. The court officially closed the case the following month, confirming me as the sole heir and legal owner of all grandmother's properties and possessions. The victory was complete and legally ironclad, but complicated by the knowledge that family relationships had been permanently altered. As I stood on the wraparound porch of grandmother's mansion, my mansion now, watching the sunset paint the Charleston sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I thought about how she would feel about everything that had unfolded. The ugliness, the accusations, the greed, but also the final honoring of her true wishes. You did exactly right, grandmother, I whispered to the evening air thick with the scent of jasmine. You saw us all clearly, even when we couldn't see ourselves. 6 months after the will reading that changed my entire existence, I sat in grandmother's garden, now my garden, watching hummingbirds dance around the Confederate jasmine she had planted decades ago. The property had evolved in subtle but meaningful ways. I'd preserved the character and warmth she had cultivated while adding touches that reflected my own personality, new medical journals in the study, a meditation space in the sunroom, wind chimes hanging from the ancient oak trees. The house no longer felt haunted by conflict and legal battles. It had become a sanctuary again, just as it had been during my childhood visits. I'd taken extended leave from the hospital to focus on settling the estate and determining my path forward. The inheritance had given me options I'd never imagined possible, but also responsibilities I was still learning to navigate properly. One rainy afternoon while organizing grandmother's desk, I found an envelope I had somehow missed during previous searches. It was addressed simply, for Victoria, after everything settles. Inside was a handwritten letter on grandmother's distinctive cream-colored stationery. My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then the storm has passed and you've weathered it successfully. Knowing our family as I do, it was likely quite a hurricane, but I had complete faith in your strength and resilience. I need to explain something I couldn't include in my official legal documents. This inheritance was never about punishing the others, though I'm sure that's how they interpreted it. It was about recognizing the heart that beats so strongly in you, the same heart your grandfather had, the same heart your father inherited and passed to you. Money changes people, Victoria. I've watched it happen throughout my long life. It can bring out selfishness, entitlement, and genuine cruelty in those who aren't prepared for its influence. But occasionally, very occasionally, wealth finds its way to someone who understands its true purpose, to create security that enables generosity rather than hoarding. I chose you not because you were perfect or because you never disappointed me. I chose you because when you made mistakes, you owned them completely. When you disagreed with me, you did so respectfully. When you helped me, you did it without any expectation of reward or recognition. The others will probably always claim I was manipulated or mentally compromised. But the truth is much simpler. I wanted my legacy in the hands of someone who would honor its spirit, not just preserve its dollar value. Now, some advice from beyond the veil. Don't let this wealth change who you are fundamentally. Use it to become more authentically yourself than ever before. Take that trip to Ireland we always discussed. Fund that pediatric trauma center you dreamed of creating. Keep the beach house in the family. Someday, you might have children who will love it as we did. And perhaps, when wounds have healed sufficiently, find ways to include the family again. Not because they deserve it, but because connection ultimately matters more than being right. Set firm boundaries, certainly. I didn't raise you to be anyone's doormat, and neither did your parents. But leave room for growth and genuine reconciliation when people prove they've changed. I love you endlessly, my dear girl. I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Grandmother Margaret. Tears streamed down my face as I read and reread her words. Even from beyond death, she was still guiding me, offering wisdom and permission to forge my own path forward with both strength and compassion. In the weeks that followed, I began implementing her suggestions with careful consideration. I established the Margaret Blake Memorial Scholarship at the nursing school I had attended, specifically for students interested in trauma care and elder advocacy. I started the complex paperwork to create a foundation focused on supporting elderly individuals without family support, people who, unlike grandmother, didn't have anyone to advocate for them in their vulnerable final years. I took that trip to Ireland, walking the same cobblestone streets in County Cork where grandmother's great-grandparents had lived before immigrating to Charleston. Standing in the ancient cemetery where my ancestors were buried, I felt a connection to family history that transcended our recent legal conflicts and bitter disputes. As for the family relationships themselves, healing came in small, unexpected moments that caught me off guard. Cousin Jessica reached out first, asking if we could meet for coffee at a neutral location. She brought photographs of her newborn daughter, whom she had named Margaret in grandmother's honor. I want her to know the real family stories, Jessica explained awkwardly, not just the polished versions we present at charity events. Would you be willing to share some of your memories with her someday when she's older? Kevin invited me to his wedding, though I suspected his fiancée had insisted on including me. Still, when I attended, he made a point of introducing me to everyone as my cousin who runs the Margaret Blake Foundation. It wasn't warm or particularly close, but it was acknowledgement and a tentative step toward normal family relations. Aunt Patricia remained distant, but sent a Christmas card with a brief note. Your grandmother would be proud of what you're accomplishing with the foundation. Coming from her, it was practically an olive branch extended across the chasm our legal battle had created. Uncle Richard never softened his position or reached out. Some wounds run too deep, some pride too rigid to bend toward reconciliation. I made peace with that painful reality while leaving the door open should he ever change his fundamental attitude. The greatest healing came through an unexpected family connection I hadn't anticipated. During one foundation fundraising event, I met grandmother's nephew Thomas, my father's cousin, who had moved to California decades earlier and lost touch with the Charleston branch of the family. He had fond, untainted memories of both grandmother and my father. David was the best of us, he told me over dinner after the event. He chose teaching and service over money and status, substance over superficial success. Margaret absolutely adored him for living so authentically, for following his true calling regardless of family pressure. Through Thomas, I discovered branches of the family completely untouched by the inheritance battle. Second and third cousins who shared stories and old photographs I'd never seen, expanding my understanding of our family history beyond the narrow, bitter narrative I'd grown up experiencing. These connections reminded me that family legacy extends far beyond money and property disputes. 1 year after grandmother's passing, I hosted a memorial dinner at the mansion. I invited only those who had genuinely cared for her as a person, Rosa and other caregivers who had shown real compassion, Mr. Thompson, neighbors who had been true friends rather than social climbers, Thomas and his family, and yes, even Jessica with baby Margaret. We shared stories, laughter, and a few healing tears, creating exactly the kind of gathering grandmother would have loved, people who appreciated her for who she was rather than what she owned. As everyone mingled in the garden afterward, Mr. Thompson approached me with a glass of grandmother's favorite sherry. "You know," he said quietly, "I've handled hundreds of estates over my career. I've seen families completely destroyed over far less money than what was at stake here. I'm not sure our family fared much better," I admitted honestly. He shook his head thoughtfully. "You misunderstand my point completely. The miracle isn't that some relationships survive this ordeal. It's that you remain true to yourself throughout the entire process." Margaret told me once that her greatest achievement wasn't accumulating wealth or achieving social status, but raising a son who valued integrity enough to pass it along to his daughter. I looked around at the gathering, not the family I had expected to have, but a chosen family bound by genuine love and respect for grandmother Margaret. On the mantel inside, her photograph watched over us all, her slight smile seeming to say she had known exactly how everything would unfold according to her careful plan. The inheritance had cost me some relationships, but had given me something far more valuable: the freedom to live by my own values, just as my father had done, just as grandmother had taught me through both words and example. I understood now that this had been her true bequest, not the mansion or the money, but the courage to stand firm in my authentic truth regardless of external pressure. As the evening ended and guests departed with warm goodbyes, I stood on the wraparound porch watching fireflies emerge in the humid Charleston twilight. "We did it, grandmother," I whispered to the jasmine-scented air. "We made everything right, exactly as you planned." The inheritance battle was over, justice had been served, and I had learned that sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't measured in dollars, but in the lessons and love we carry forward into our own authentic lives. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against family pressure or manipulation? I'd love to hear your stories about finding strength in difficult family situations. Sometimes the most important inheritance we receive isn't money or property, but the courage to honor our own truth and values, just as my grandmother Margaret taught me through her final, perfect lesson in character and consequence.